Well, you all have had a very long series of conferences, and you've been talked at more than you've had a chance to answer questions. So I'm going to give you a very short overview and then just toss it open and we'll go back and forth and you can ask questions and direct it the way you want to. You already got my general overview a while ago that I think that we're somewhere between a very substantial Republican victory and a catastrophic disaster for the Democrats, and that's sort of the range of where we are right now. I think the odds are, if you were looking at ranges, you'd have to say the odds are better than 90% that Boehner will be the next Speaker of the House, and about 45% that McConnell will be the majority leader. But that's on the low side of potential expectations. There is an outside possibility of a genuinely catastrophic election in which you'll see somewhere between 70 and 100 House seats switch and 11 plus Senate seats switch. And if that happens, then you're really in a historically different environment. One way to measure election night at 9:30 Eastern time, we're going to webcast from the Ronald Reagan building at americansolutions.com if you want to join us and watch the returns come in. I'm frankly, personally looking forward to it. It'll be a very interesting evening to see what actually happens as opposed to what we think is going to actually happen. And the two are not always the same. But part of what we're going to be looking at is whether or not you get the next layer out. We're pretty sure there's a block of seats the Republicans are going to gain. We're not, there are two more layers beyond that, and you'll begin to see pretty early in the evening on the East Coast. In Georgia, for example, do we pick up 1 seat or 3 seats would be a significant indicator of what's going on. In South Carolina, we're almost certainly going to pick up a seat. And you go around in Pennsylvania, we're probably going to pick up 5 seats, but we could pick up more. So you'll look around, you'll see these things starting to happen. But what I thought I would do for it is just give you a different framework is, I've written a number of historical novels, some of which are kind of what-if novels, where we say, you know, what if something different had happened, and what could then have happened? And I want to give you 3 turning points that didn't have to get us to where we are today. The first turning point was the Republicans. If the Republicans in 2004 had run an ideological rather than a personality campaign, they would probably have crushed John Kerry. Kerry was more liberal than Teddy Kennedy. On 53 issues, he was in a minority of 77 to 17 in popular support. And it's very likely, had they set up an issue-oriented campaign and asked the country to choose between where Kerry was and where the president was, that they would have won a Reagan, Mondale, or Nixon-McGovern-sized majority, increased their control of the House and Senate, and set the stage for 2005 to be a very successful reform year. Because they didn't do that when they got into 2005, they didn't have any momentum of reform. And they didn't have a Congress that was committed to reform. And the result is, all through 2005 and 2006, the country got increasingly unhappy with the Republicans. In some ways, it began to really peak with Katrina and the way in which the Corps of Engineers and the Federal Emergency Management Agency mishandled rescue work down here. And it just kept compounding all through 2006 with scandals and a sense of corruption and this whole general tone that hit them. And it's worth you going back and looking at that because none of that was inevitable. But once the Republicans, frankly, went sour, the country made a decision, and the decision was no. And so you look, for example, and I began warning about this in 2005. You look at the 2006 U.S. Senate races, there are 6 close incumbent Republican senators. They lose all 6. They're 0 for 6. Now, that means it's not a personality problem. It means that people are walking in the booth saying, I'm not going to vote for you, or people are staying home because they're saying, I don't want to vote for you, and I'm not going to vote for the Democrat. Well, this is part of what creates tides. If you have an election in which your side stays home, they stay home for everything. They stay home for governor, they stay home for Congress, they stay home for the Senate, they stay home for the state legislature, and suddenly you end up in a catastrophic free fall where it doesn't matter how good your commercials work because nobody's voting. And so you suddenly find, and this is what happened to the Senate Republicans in 2006, and I think it was a huge shock to them, although some of us had tried to warn people all year that they were going to lose the House and Senate because they had no positive story to tell. So that's the first thing that could have gone different. A reform Republicanism that was idea-oriented would have won the election of '04 by a bigger margin, would have continued a momentum of reform, and would have been reelected in 2006. Instead, you end up with Pelosi and Reid taking charge of the Congress, and if you look, all the bad economic indicators come after Pelosi and Reid are in charge of the Congress. I'm not blaming them for it, but I'm saying almost everything they did made it worse. You look at the Housing Act of 2007, it's just a disaster, or 2008 rather, it's just a disaster. I mean, it's a perfect Barney Frank, Chris Dodd, socialized housing project. And again, they're just doing dumb things. So at that point, here's the second unknown story. I spent a year saying to Sean Hannity and others, Hillary Clinton's going to be the Democratic nominee. And I look back at that and I'll tell you flatly, in January of 2007, Hillary Clinton should have been the Democratic nominee. She represented the dominant political force in the Democratic Party. Her husband had regained his popularity and was probably the most popular Democrat in the country. She had New York State as a base. She is a very good fundraiser. She had a nationwide organization. And she ran a campaign so bad, while Obama was running a campaign so good, that in the end, you have Obama come from being a state senator to a U.S. senator to the presidential nominee in 4 years, which is virtually unthinkable. And I certainly didn't think it was possible. And to give you an example of how narrow history sometimes is decided, Hillary actually beats Obama for delegates in states that have primaries. So all this notion that he was somehow magically popular is just not true. Where the margin of his nomination is places like North Dakota, Minnesota, and Idaho, where they are picking people in caucuses. And the reason is the active anti-war left on the college campuses was prepared to work very aggressively on a decentralized basis. So he was able to organize all of these small states. Hillary's staff, based in New York, thinking about big states, were prepared to engage. And you see this, by the way, in the Texas primary. She beats him in the Texas primary the same day they have a caucus. He beats her in the caucus. And what she didn't understand is, if she's carrying Ohio by, say, a 10-delegate margin, so she really wins a big vote in the primary, but the total net is a 10 delegates. She gets 10 more delegates. But he's carrying Idaho and gets all 11 delegates. He actually got more net delegates out of Idaho than she got out of Ohio. So all of a sudden, by the summer of 2008, he's the nominee. He's in a much closer race with McCain than people think. We had developed a project called Drill Here, Drill Now, Pay Less, which was aimed at the gasoline crisis, and when gasoline was at $3 a gallon. And the fact is that the whole issue of energy and of American energy was propelling McCain. And the week before Wall Street collapsed, McCain was up 3 and the Republican generic was up 5. And this idea that Obama was somehow magically popular wasn't true. Take as another example the case study in Iowa. Once people went back and looked at how he actually won Iowa, he had 146 offices in Iowa. I mean, that's probably more than every other candidate in the history of the Iowa caucus has had. And so what you had was an attractive, articulate person with enormous amounts of money from the left, who raised more money than anyone in history. He raised far more than George W. Bush did as an incumbent president. And so he basically got the nomination, and then in a bad economic year, he beat a relatively inarticulate Republican candidate, and he became president. So that was the second thing. The first was the Republicans could have continued to govern. The second was Hillary should have been the nominee and should have been the most likely next president. The third is Obama himself. My wife Calista is here. She and I went to the inaugural in 2009. And as we were leaving the inaugural, if you read his inaugural address and you go back and read his Grant Park speech on election night, they're both very good speeches. And they're very unifying speeches. It's Barack Obama as an American. It's bringing us together. It's bipartisanship. It's transparency. It somehow will solve problems together. And I said to Calista as I was leaving we were leaving that afternoon, if he governs from the center, he will split the Republican Party. Because he'll split the Republicans into the hardline anti-Obama faction and the we can work together faction. And I said, and he could dominate in the way that Eisenhower did in the 50s. And within 2 weeks, he threw it all away. I mean, if you go back and look carefully, it is an amazing negative achievement. Because within 2 weeks, he said, I want a $787 billion stimulus package. I'm going to let Nancy Pelosi write it in a totally partisan way. We're going to ram it through fast enough that nobody will have read it. And by the way, let's work together. And what that did is it signaled every Republican in the House and Senate this was total war. And from that point on, they never turned back. At the same time, it signaled the country. All the talk he gave you about transparency and accountability and openness was baloney. So the average American sitting out there going, let me get this straight. My congressman just voted for a $787 billion package that they didn't read, that they don't have any idea what's in it. And you want me to believe this is not a machine? I mean, the Chicago City Council wouldn't have done that. And so literally by February, late February of 09, he has sent the signal which has defined the last 2 years. Now that was not inevitable. He could have governed in a very different way and he would today dominate American politics instead of, I think, being on the edge of being the Democratic Herbert Hoover. Now, there's one more piece of this. And I'm just talking up to tomorrow night, up to election night. If you want to, you can ask questions. We'll think beyond this. But I'm just trying to get you to understand how we got to where we are, because I think where we are may be so profound that it's worth spending some time digesting it. He has two very different problems, and he's beginning to acquire a third. The first problem is performance. You can't be at 9.6% unemployment as the President of the United States and sit there for a year and a half at 9.6% unemployment and not just be in terrible trouble. Because the American people are, the same person who's a tough customer is a tough voter. And they're sitting out there going, let me get this straight. We did an event for American Solutions, a jobs rally, 2 days ago in Jacksonville. 11.9% unemployment. Probably better than 20% U6 number, which is underemployment, unemployment, and people who quit looking for work. Every fifth person. You can't, this is not a country where every fifth person is economically unhappy and talking to all their friends about how economically unhappy they are, and the president's going to be doing well. I mean, Reagan didn't do well in '82 because the recession was so deep that even though it was Carter's recession and even though Reagan was beginning to pull us out of it, people didn't cut him any slack. So this idea that you have never had any election year since the Great Depression in which unemployment was above 8% except 1982. And in 1982, we lost 29 House seats from a much lower base than the Democrats have today. Now you have a president who's been above 9.5, 9.6, 9.7% month after month after month. You can't have that and not suffer a terrible performance record. He has a second problem. He's a genuine radical. I mean, I don't mean this in a negative way. He is an authentic South Side Chicago revelry for radicals person who really did come into office thinking that he would fundamentally remake America. Our daughter, Jackie Cushman, writes a weekly column, and she wrote a couple months ago that we were told we were voting for change you could believe in and found we'd voted for somebody who wanted to change what we believe. And the country came to believe that. And his radicalism is such that he's amazingly tone deaf. As I said earlier in the panel, think about it. He had a chance to back off last August, in August of 2009, when the Democrats couldn't go home anymore because the town hall meetings were too hostile. Well, in a healthy, rational, self-governing country, if your constituents are so mad at you, you can't go home, you really ought to go listen to them. I always used to tell the members when I was speaker, you don't hire them, they hire you. So if they decide they're unhappy with you, they're going to fire you. Now that doesn't mean you have to pander to them, but you got to go home and find out what are they thinking? Why are they thinking this? You know, maybe you're wrong, maybe they're right. So they ignored it. They went through all of last fall of 2009, September, October, November, December, every single month. Every poll said the country didn't want Obamacare, and the more he talked about it, the more the country didn't want it. The margin began to increase, so he'd go out and make speeches. People go, got it. Now I understand what you're talking about. Boy, is that dumb. And he was actually, I remember one day, Cliff and I were talking, and they announced that he was going to be on 5 Sunday shows. And I thought, what a total waste of the presidency. And if you're in 5 shows, you're meaningless, you're irrelevant. Why would I listen to you? Because I know if I don't listen to you today, you'll be back. So he literally was devaluing his ability to communicate. Then they lost Teddy Kennedy's seat, as I said a while ago. You can't make this stuff up. They have a special election in Massachusetts on health care for Senator Kennedy's seat when he has spent 30 years on that issue. And they lose it. Now, that was technically the moment in self-government when they should have stopped and said, you know, maybe we'd better rewrite the bill. Instead, they said, in the great tradition of the Chicago machine, who cares what you think? We're just going to run over you. And they had this is what was a fascinating difficulty. And let me say up front, Dick Armey, my wife close to, who used to be the chief clerk of the Ag Committee in the House, and myself, all 3 of us are creatures of the House. So what I'm about to tell you represents the bias of House members. House members generally think that the Senate doesn't do very much work. And part of this is actually true. I mean this analytically for a second, in addition to it being funny and it makes me happy to say it. The Senate Finance Committee for the last 20 years on both parties has done markups without legislation. They have an outline. And they kind of go, well, are you for this or not for this? And they vote and all that stuff. Then the staff actually writes the bill after they pass it. And then what they do is they go to conference with the House and they flesh out all the things that don't work. Now, here's what happened. When Scott Brown won Teddy Kennedy's seat, they couldn't go to conference because they couldn't take the bill back to the Senate because they'd lost the ability to break the filibuster. And so they were faced with 2 choices. They could ram through the Senate bill with no edits. It's a 2,600-page bill written in the style of the Senate, which means it's kind of vague and confusing and has language that's incoherent. But they couldn't fix it. And so they decided, Pelosi said, I can ram it through. And they said, fine, ram it through, we'll have a signing ceremony. Let me give you one example of what this leads to. There is a section in the Senate bill which creates a long-term care insurance program which every American will be enrolled in unless you actively unenroll, which will take money out of your paycheck every month, and after you've paid in for 5 years, you will get an unknown amount of benefit, which the Congressional Budget Office said will be more expensive and less valuable than any private insurance would be, and it will be run by an agency which is not defined, whose rules are not defined, and whose regulations don't exist. And that section was written as a press release by a staff member in honor of Teddy Kennedy. That's now federal law. The estimated cost the first decade is $10 billion. It had no hearings, no commentary, no expert testimony. They just dropped it in for fun about 2 o'clock in the morning one night. That's now law. So you get this 2,600-page monstrosity. So if the first problem is performance, the second problem is radicalism. This is the first time, and I can remember in American history, where a major bill was rammed through which 2/3 of the country wants to repeal. And by the way, the longer they've talked about it, the more the country wants to repeal it. Because the more people learn about it, the dumber they think it is. And the more dangerous to them they think it is. I was in Minnesota campaigning 2 days after 3M announced that they would probably drop all their insurance coverage for retirees as a result of the Obama bill. Boeing has announced they're dropping 90,000 employees' coverage as a result of the Obama bill. Well, I mean, those kind of things are just they're like hammer blows in terms of every business I know is looking at whether or not to drop all coverage for its employees in 2014. Every business. Restaurants tell me if you're above 30 hours a week, you're covered by the bill. They're now making active plans to hire people for 29.5 hours a week. They're just going to methodically redesign their entire program in order to avoid the bill. I mean, people don't, people in Washington don't understand. American people are smart and they're clever and they follow self-interest, and they're going to try to get around things that are stupid. So that's the second one. The third problem that I've been watching that's really only begun to emerge in the last couple of weeks, and Calista and I have been kicking around because she noticed, for example, I was on the road, but she noticed the president did Jon Stewart on The Daily Show the other night. As Obama is failing to communicate and failing to break through, he's starting to flounder in a way which actually shrinks the presidency. I mean, when you're president of the United States, I first noticed it when he went on The View and he sat on the couch with 4 of the women. I don't know if any of you saw this picture. But it looked like a teenager auditioning for the prom. I mean, it had no relationship to the President of the United States. I mean, why would the President of the United States sit on a couch with 4 women to chat? I can't imagine Reagan doing that. And so he goes on Jon Stewart, and for 30 minutes, Jon Stewart treats him as an everyday citizen. But he's not an everyday citizen. He's the President of the United States. And towards the end, they get to be such everyday citizens that Stewart refers to him as dude. Well, what Obama's doing is he's devaluing, he had earned the presidency. He had the right to be president of the United States. He's allowed to have Hail to the Chief. He gets Air Force One. He gets Marine One. It's a big deal, He is devaluing it into this interesting part-time professor from the University of Chicago who wants to rap with us. That gives away an immense amount of his psychological advantage as president. And I think it's going to be a very big challenge for him. If they get beat as badly as they're going to, as I think they're going to, he's going to have a very big challenge trying to reestablish his authority. Because I think people are just going to say, you failed. And I think the Republicans are going to be inclined to give him 0 slack. So that's about where we are. That's a sweeping overview of the last 6 years. And let's toss it open to questions, and we'll go to whatever topic you want. Just come up and use the mics. Anybody wants to if you want to just queue up at the microphones, I'll go back and forth. Yes, sir.
Who's your pick for the 2012 presidential nominee? Republican nominee for president.
Oh, I think we'll have a bunch of candidates. I think Romney will run. Palin might run. I think Mitch Daniel, the governor of Indiana, will probably run. Haley Barbour may run, the governor of Mississippi. Tim Pawlenty is almost certainly running, the governor of Minnesota. John Thune, senator from South Dakota. We'll have a pretty good gaggle. Yes?
Yeah, prevailing opinion of a lot of people I know is that the government of the United States is no longer the government of the people. It's a plutocracy that's controlled by the moneyed elite. You have the Wall Street getting involved in every administration to their benefit, to the detriment of the American people. You have Glass-Steagall going under Clinton. You got Bush taking leverage to 40-1. You have McCain and Obama voting for this TARP bailout bill 2 weeks before the election last time. You have massive fraud throughout the entire mortgage industry, and not one person has gone to jail. It seems like someone has bought and paid for the government of the United States, and the people have lost control. If a new Republican control comes about, will these new leaders get it? Or are we getting more of the same control from this moneyed elite, only it's called a different party?
Well, I think that it's unlikely that everybody's going to get it in the first round, but I think this election is the first of a series of elections. And I think clearly the people who are being elected by the Tea parties are total system, and the fact that in 7 different Senate primaries, the grassroots candidate beat the establishment is a sign that the country is in fact very unhappy. My guess is that Boehner is going to have somewhere between 80 and 100 freshmen to deal with, between a third and over a third of his conference. And many of those will be from totally outside the traditional establishment. So I think you're going to see continuous turmoil. And I don't think that the problems we're faced with are going to be solved in the next 2 years. So I think the next couple of election cycles are all going to involve a great desire to fundamentally reform the system. And I think that will actually grow in intensity. I'm sorry, what?
Do you have any opinions on the recent Supreme Court decision that allows corporations unlimited amount of money to campaign funds?
Yeah, I think we actually ought to have it doesn't technically quite do that, but I think what we ought to have is a system that says individuals can contribute any amount they want to an after-tax money as long as it's reported overnight on the internet, and get rid of all of the FEC baloney that basically just restricts citizens and protects incumbents. But then I would not allow corporations, whether unions or corporations, to anonymously participate in politics.
I've got two different questions that are completely separate. One of them is, the first one is that how can Obama, who really can't, in my estimation, talk intelligently without his two teleprompters, be considered intelligent? And then the second question:
How can he be considered what?
Why do people say he's so intelligent if he can't really talk intelligently without a teleprompter? That's
well,
my
I mean,
first question.
that's not totally fair. He's obviously pretty darn smart. He didn't get to be the editor of the Harvard Law Review by being stupid. And he didn't get to be a U.S. senator and then get to be presidential nominee by being stupid. But I think he's a person who hasn't practiced much having to think on his feet. I think he tends to do much better if he has 2 or 3 hours to think something through and lay it out. But I don't underestimate his base intelligence. I think that he's a relatively clever person who, after all, at a very early age, got to be president of the United States. And the fact that he has a series of ideas that are utterly irrational is not a comment on his IQ, it's a comment on his education.
Well, I'll grant you that. The second question is, when the new type Republicans get elected to Congress, will they be able to abolish the completely wasteful and useless energy agency?
My hope is that they will start down the road towards an American energy policy, and that a part of that will involve dismantling the Department of Energy.
Good. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. I think that the microphone in the middle is not on yet.
It's not on?
Now
Okay,
you're on.
Thanks. Thank you for all your comments and a great conference. I am a physician. I'm in solo practice in a business that my father started 60 years ago. And I, as well as many of my colleagues, feel like we're not sure we can continue to practice under the conditions that have been set forth in Obamacare. And that makes me sad because I have 3rd and 4th generation patients that I'm serving, and even thoughts of leaving the country. It's been very frustrating that we feel like we didn't have a voice at the table, that we were sold down the road by the AMA, that only 17% of physicians are members of. And I just wondered, what your thoughts are as far as...
I think you raise a couple of different, very pertinent points. I helped found the Center for Health Transformation because I believe we have to have a much more market-oriented, personal responsibility, fundamentally decentralization of the health system, and not the exact opposite direction from Obamacare. And I agreed with some of the comments in the panel earlier. My strong advice to the Republicans is to spend 6 to 8 weeks holding hearings on what's wrong with Obamacare, then pass the repeal in the House, and then go into every Democratic state, which is where the Democrats up in 2012, gather a petition drive asking them to vote yes to repeal Obamacare. I think there's a better than 50-50 chance we can pass it in the Senate and build enough pressure. And then I would hold the bill at the desk until we got 50 million signatures asking the president to sign it, and print out the 50 million signatures and have McConnell and Boehner take it down to the White House and basically say to the president, you can be president of the American people and sign the repeal, or you can decide to repudiate the American people, in which case in March of 2013 we'll repeal it with your successor, but it's your choice. And I think that's the only way to approach it. And by the way, in the interim, I would zero out all the money that's available to implement the bill and refuse to pass any money for the implementation of the bill.
You have described the diminishment of the presidency by Obama. Where do you think that phenomenon will manifest itself around the world in our foreign relationships?
Well, I think it manifests itself every day. I think that the way the Chinese deal with us on occasion is a sign of their lack of respect for him. The way the Iranians deal with him regularly is a sign of their lack of respect. The increased tension with North Korea is a sign of their lack of respect. Most of the Europeans don't take him seriously. I don't get any great sense of Obama's, he made everybody like him because he wasn't George W. Bush, but in fact, one of the major reasons they're mad at George W. Bush is he represented America. So in a way, Obama has given away the ability to represent the United States in order for people to like him, but in liking him, they have no interest in doing what he wants, because the thing they like about him is he's weak. And so they're glad to say to him, Jeff, come visit me. I'll be glad to tolerate you, but don't expect me to do anything. And I think that it's very important to watch carefully how much he has presided over the decay of America's role in the world. Very, very parallel to Jimmy Carter.
And so what impact do you think this wave election will have in the minds of foreign governments?
They'll be stunned. I think this election will reverberate all around the planet. Yes, sir.
My question to you is a two-part question. First of all, I'd like to know if you're going to be running for president in 2012.
Okay, and the second part?
And I hear, I've been listening to you talk about repealing Obamacare. What do you have in place of Obamacare instead of just repealing it?
That's a good question. Look, on the first one, Callista and I recognize that there may well be a moral obligation as citizens to represent a very, very different approach to how America solves its problems than Obama represents. And we run 4 small businesses, and we're in the process of organizing them so that if we do conclude we have to run, we'd be able to transition them. And we'll probably make that decision, I would say, in February or March of next year. And clearly, we understand it's a very real possibility. If you go to healthtransformation.net, I wrote a book in 2002 called Saving Lives and Saving Money. We laid out an entire program. We have an organization which has about 100 members, including all sorts of different backgrounds, from hospitals to insurance companies to drug companies. We work with state governments. We've developed layer after layer of sound, common sense, personal responsibility, market-oriented solutions. And frankly, I think about 10% of the Obama bill is actually pretty useful. So out of 2,600 pages, I think we could find 260 pages that we could pass after we repeal the whole thing, but I would not get into trying to repeal part of it. I think it is a fundamental mistake to allow any of that bill to survive. If things are good enough, you can pass them slowly, transparently, out in the open, in relatively small bills that are understandable. And I'm happy to have people start doing that the week after we repeal Obamacare. And we have lots of ideas about, the young lady who just spoke, who's a doctor. There are lots of good ideas here. I mean, I just was last night with a wonderful group in Fort Worth who are medical doctors who have tons of ideas about how to have a better system that's less expensive. What Charles Krauthammer said, I mean, if you start with eliminating the threat of unnecessary and illegitimate tort lawyers, you dramatically lower the amount of defensive medicine, and you save hundreds of billions of dollars. If you go to electronic funds transfer and you eliminate the crooks, you save between 70 and 120 billion dollars a year. And I'm not talking about a doctor who upcharges or a hospital makes a clerical mistake. I'm talking about an Albanian crime ring that was just picked up for, I think, dozens of millions of dollars of theft. I'm talking about the Russian mafia in Los Angeles in durable medical equipment. I'm talking about 5 pizza parlors in Miami that were certified by Florida Medicaid as HIV/AIDS transfusion centers. I mean, you know, you have today, the federal government is such an incompetent administrator of your money that you today have 9 to 5 clerks using paper against 18-hour-a-day crooks using BlackBerries and cell phones. Now, you can't catch up in paper with a guy who's using, or a woman who's using a BlackBerry or an iPhone. And that's where we are today. We think it's $70 to $120 billion a year. And so between the tort reform ideas that Krauthammer talked about and getting rid of the crooks, you could save enough money. And I tried to tell the White House this at one point. I said, if you want $1 trillion, we'll find you $1 trillion. But we'll do it intelligently. We won't do it stupidly. And I think you could have a fundamentally less expensive, fundamentally better system if you reestablish the doctor-patient relationship at the center of it, and if you established individual responsibility as a key component of that, because you cannot manage chronic conditions without the individual being engaged in their own health.
Yes, I was in two healthcare startup companies in the 1990s. One of them we took public in 1999. I'm currently CEO of a biotechnology company. You were one of the great voices of technological innovation and the entrepreneur economy of the 1980s and 90s. We have a problem now in trying to commercialize many innovations. It's not just a matter of the lack of wealth creation that we saw during that time, but also there are many technological innovation that is stymied because we don't have the commercialization opportunities. People that are going public are going to Hong Kong, they're going to Europe. We're losing that, the capital in the other market. With your background in healthcare and also with this issue, could you talk about what we need to do to maybe break some of the barriers and try and drive that in America again?
Repeal the Sarbanes-Oxley, which has been a huge anti-entrepreneur, anti-technology bill, totally artificially added to the cost of venture capital and of startups. Fundamentally overhaul the Food and Drug Administration so that there's no net advantage to bringing something to market overseas. I mean, today, increasing number of companies are going to go to China or Europe because there's just too much red tape to get something approved in the United States. Change the ground rules at the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services so you don't have to go through a second layer of approval after the Food and Drug Administration approves it in order to make it commercially viable. Change the tax law. I mean, you want to compete with China in job creation? Match the Chinese on capital gains. They have zero capital gains tax. You had zero capital gains tax in the U.S., you'd have an explosion of entrepreneurship. We have a bill that Congressman Jordan introduced, which you can see at AmericanSolutions.com, which is the Economic Freedom Act. Zero capital gains, the Irish corporate tax rate of 12.5%, 100% expensing for new equipment for business so that they can have the most modern technology in the world, eliminate the death tax permanently because it's a culturally destructive and immoral tax, and finally, a 50% reduction in Social Security and Medicare tax for both the employer and the employee for the next year in order to restart the economy by creating liquidity for small business. And you take Congressman Jordan's bill, and then finally you have to have education reform because you have to be able to produce technologically advanced workers in the United States if you're going to compete with China and India. And so those steps, you took those steps, we'd reestablish ourselves as the leading innovative center in the world.
What advice would you give to Tea Party leaders of individual Tea Parties around the country to keep the momentum going through 2012?
Set very few and very specific goals for the Congress and monitor the Congress to make sure it follows those. And be equally militant with Republicans as well as Democrats so people know you have integrity and authenticity and that it's about achievement. It's not about ego. It's not about partisanship. It's about achievement. I've been spending a lot of time thinking about how do you run this new Congress? Because they don't have the advantage we had of having a contract with America. They don't have the advantage of 40 years in the wilderness. And so they're not going to have a long, by the time I was able to put together a majority, I'd spent 16 years in the project. So I was able to train an entire cadre of people. They're not going to have any of those advantages. And they're up against a president who I think is fundamentally different than Bill Clinton. And so what occurred to me was a line I had learned from Ronald Reagan, that great leaders have to be like lions, in that lions have to hunt antelope or zebra because they can't afford to hunt chipmunks because even if they catch them, they starve to death. And so Reagan, who set out consciously to be a great leader, had 3 antelope. Renew American economic growth by cutting regulations, cutting taxes, and speaking well of American entrepreneurs so you rebuilt their pride and their excitement and their enthusiasm. 2, rebuild American civic culture so people were proud to be American. 3, defeat the Soviet Empire. Now, if you think about it, those are, as of 1979, 1980, those are pretty big goals. And he would get up every morning and he'd basically remind himself, what am I doing? Oh yeah, renewing the economy, rebuilding our civic culture, defeating the Soviet Empire. He'd walk into the Oval Office about 10 in the morning and chipmunks would run in. Now, you can have a $10 million federal chipmunk. I mean, $10 billion federal chipmunk. You know, and so Reagan, who was a very disciplined, very patient man, would listen to the chipmunks, and he would say, you know, you are a terrific chipmunk. Have you met Jim Baker? And his chief of staff became the largest chipmunk collector on the planet. Now, people thought this management style was a sign that he was floating up here at 50,000 feet. That's a fundamental misunderstanding of great leadership. When something came in which mattered to him, he would dive all the way down. I'm going to give you two quick examples. I'm going to show you how this applies to the Congress in just a minute and how it applies to the Tea Parties. First example, he decided that he wanted to call the Soviet Union an evil empire in 1983. That he thought in terms of waging moral warfare and psychological warfare that there was a substantial advantage to being clear that they were evil. And he also knew that the National Security Council and the State Department would fight to the death to stop him from doing it, because they would regard it as deeply offensive, inappropriate, you know, the wrong language to use. This is a sovereign nation, and it's a great power, it's dangerous. So Tony Dolan, who was his chief speechwriter for 8 years and is a good friend of ours, told us this story, that they deliberately decided to give the speech to evangelical ministers in Florida, so that it would not sound at all like a foreign policy speech, and they labeled it a political speech. They then wrote the most boring speech for Reagan ever written, and it was the first third of the speech. The speech comes over to the National Security Council, who has to vet every speech, and they go, well, a political speech to a bunch of evangelical ministers. They give it to the most junior person at the National Security Council. The most junior person starts reading, gets about 5 pages in, and goes, this is really bad stuff. I don't want to read this. I'm an intellectual who deals with foreign policy. I don't deal with this kind of stuff. So they approve it without realizing what's in it. They get to Florida. Reagan tears off the first third of the speech. Now, I want you to think about the level of detailed management. This is why I said it's not that he's floating up here. When it's his antelopes, he's down here. The other example is equally good. We did a movie, Clifton and I did a movie called Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny. And part of the movie is the famous scene at the Berlin Wall. Reagan had gone to Berlin as governor in 1967. And he had a throwaway line. He looked at the wall and he said, that wall sure is ugly. They ought to tear it down. So he's going to go back in 87. Now remember, by 1987, he has been re-elected president carrying 49 states. He's gone back to the Berlin Wall, and he wants to say, Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall. He writes it in a speech. It goes over to the State Department to be edited, and the State Department takes it out of the speech because they think it'll offend Gorbachev. It comes back to the White House. Reagan personally handwrites it back in the speech. Sends it back over to the State Department. It comes back a second time, taken out. And Secretary Shultz told me this story. Reagan writes it in a third time, picks up the phone, calls Secretary, says, Georgie, tell your editor, I'm the president, they're not. It stays in. And of course, he delivered, it's the most famous line out of that whole thing. My point is, what you've got to do is decide on a very limited number of antelope. The Republicans should decide early on, and the Tea Partiers should help pick these antelope. One is a fight over repeal of Obamacare. A second is, in the very first week of the new Congress, the House Ways and Means Committee should pass out no tax increase on any American during a recession. And it should pass the House floor the second week. It should go to the Senate with an explicit effort to get it to the President before the State of the Union. So the President has to decide. Does he want to protect every American from a tax increase and help create jobs? Or does he want to wage class warfare so badly that he's willing to further mess up the economy and cause even more unemployment? But let's get the fight out in the open. Third, they have got to dramatically cut spending. And if they will take that size project, then you can have lots of noise and lots of chipmunks running around under feet and lots of members being goofy on Sunday shows. It doesn't matter. You stay focused on the big ones, and you're going to start moving the country back to an acceptance that these guys are serious. We were helped. This is one of the great Washington mythologies. We were helped when we closed the government in December of '95 because it convinced people we were serious about balancing the budget. And all of a sudden, our allies across the country who had been betrayed so many times suddenly sat up and said, wow, they really actually want to balance the budget. And so even though the Washington press corps was shocked, the country at large thought, you know, I'm glad to see they're serious. And the result was, it also shocked Clinton. And the result was we got 4 straight years of a balanced budget for the first time since the 1920s, and we paid off $405 billion in debt while cutting taxes to increase economic opportunity so people went to work, got off food stamps, got off unemployment, got off Medicaid, and started paying taxes.
Thank you, Mr. Gingrich. First of all, I'd like to say I've got an enormous respect for your knowledge of history, and I think you'll make one of the best presidents we've had since Reagan. Given the protests and riots and strikes we've seen with some little token efforts at austerity around the world, has there been examples in our past of good and decent societies returning from the brink that have gotten this far down a bad road fiscally?
Sure. Look, if you get a chance to look at Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny, which frankly is a pretty good movie because if you do 90 minutes of Ronald Reagan on television, he's really good. We didn't mess it up too much. But part of what we have 6 minutes in there of Jimmy Carter. And we do it to remind ourselves, 1979, 1980 was a mess. We were at 13% inflation, 22% interest rates. We were sliding into the deepest recession since the Great Depression. We had a 444-day Iranian hostage crisis where the dictatorship had illegally seized our embassy and were holding our diplomats hostage. The Soviets had invaded Afghanistan. They were active in Mozambique, Angola, Grenada, Nicaragua. They were starting to move into El Salvador. I mean, the world looked, as Theodore White wrote in his book for about that year, by February of 1980, it looked like the wheels were coming apart. You know, the whole system looked terrible. Ronald Reagan comes along, and in a matter of 2 years, he turns everything around. Now, he does 2 decisive things in the spring of 1981 that shocked people. If you go to the Reagan Library, you'll see one of them. These are the 2 things, by the way, that convinced the Soviet Union he was a serious person. One is, Gaddafi had announced grandly that there was a line of death in a gulf in the Mediterranean. And Reagan and the American military very methodically set out and said, okay, we're going to cross Gaddafi's deadline. And if Gaddafi flies aircraft against our aircraft carrier, we're going to shoot him down. And in fact, that's what happened. And they have at the Reagan Library an F-14, which was representative of the aircraft which shot down the Libyan aircraft. Well, what was shocking about it was not that we could shoot him down because people knew we could. But the press the next day said to the president, did they wake you in the middle of the night to tell you this had happened? And he said, no. He said, we have an agreement. They shoot us down, you wake me. We shoot them down, let me sleep and tell me in the morning. Now, the calm confidence with which he said that shook the Kremlin. The second thing was something I was deeply involved in. I had been endorsed twice by the Professional Air Traffic Control Organization running for Congress. And I was on the aviation subcommittee, and I'd been through hearings with them. And I was pretty close to their leadership. And I sat down with them in the spring of 1981, and I said, guys, you have this great strategy. You're going to go out on strike. You're going to close down the air traffic control system. The government's going to have to collapse. They're going to give you the pay raise you want. It's terrific, except for one thing. Carter lost the election. I said, this would have worked against Carter because he would have flinched. I said, you do this to Reagan, he's going to fire you. And they said, oh, he can't fire us. After all, he can't have the entire air traffic control system closed down. I said, you don't get it. Reagan's going to operate on principle. He's going to go all the way back to Calvin Coolidge about the right to strike by public employees, and he's going to fire you. And he's going to ask the country to tolerate a period of transition while they train a new generation of air traffic controllers, and they're going to replace all of you. And they say, oh, he can't do it, he can't do it. Well, I went down to the White House because I was very concerned. These were my constituents. I represented the Atlanta airport, and I represented the Hampton Air Traffic Control Center. I had the largest block of air traffic controllers in the country outside of Washington. And I went down to the White House, and Drew Lewis was there, who was Secretary of Transportation. So we got off and huddled in a corner for a minute. And he said, let me tell you about reality. He said, because I want you to understand the choice we're faced with, and I want your advice. Because we know how big a problem this is for you. He said, we have to break the wage inflation, which is part of what's killing this country. And we have to break inflation in general, which is why we're backing Paul Volcker in a hard money, high interest rate policy to just break the inflation. He said, now we have two choices. In June, we have the air traffic controllers, 19,000 employees. In August, we have 637,000 postmen. Now, if we cave to the air traffic controllers, we will have to take a general strike from 637,000 postmen who will believe we've sent the signal that we're weak. He said, now, if those are your two choices, which group, if you're the president, which group would you pick? And he said, and by the way, if we fire the air traffic controllers, everybody in the post office will get it. Because you can replace postmen a lot faster than you can replace air traffic controllers. And you looked at that, I mean, you looked at it as a factual matter, and he said, he doesn't have any choice. And I went back and I saw the air traffic controllers. I said, guys, this is my last chance because I'm on your side psychologically, but I'm also loyal to the President of the United States, and I'm telling you, you strike, you're gone. They just couldn't, they literally couldn't believe it. I tell you that story for this reason. The Soviets were totally shaken by the courage of the president being willing to fire the air traffic controllers because it didn't fit their model. And the Soviets said to themselves, if he'll shoot down the Libyan planes and not notice it, and he'll fire the air traffic controllers, this is a very different leader than we've been used to with Carter. And we had better rethink all of our plans because this is a much higher risk business than we thought. I think the same thing has to happen in the next couple of years. We have to say calmly and steadily, for example, to the public employee unions, we're not going to live in a country where the public employee unions are the haves and the taxpayers are the have-nots. It's not going to happen. And the only question is how rapidly we change.
America has surrendered a lot of its financial independence, its energy independence, and its manufacturing independence. Yet we remain very strong advocates of free trade globally. Why is it that the President of the United States and others can't step forward and say, let's buy American? Let's emphasize American source financing, manufacturing, energy.
Well, they can, they should. I mean, we have a project at American Solutions for an American energy policy that focuses on creating American energy on two very simple principles. The first is, if you kept $500 billion of energy purchases in the United States, rather than sending the money to Saudi Arabia or Venezuela and or Iraq, we'd be both better off in terms of balance of trade, and we'd be better off in terms of national security. 79% of the American people agree with that. But what it requires is, and you're going to see this across the whole system, the next decade is going to be a period of fundamentally breaking up the old order and fundamentally breaking up the establishment which has run this country since 1932, because you cannot solve our problems inside their framework. Now, I'll just close with this example. I got briefed this morning by somebody here in Louisiana who's very knowledgeable about the energy business. The president supposedly lifted the moratorium on drilling, except they've now established a new permit system, and they won't issue any permits. And you just have to understand this. The depth of bias against the United States among our elites is visible. And so you have to actually go out and say, what's it going to, we're benchmarking at American Solutions, and I'll close with this, but we're benchmarking what would it take to compete with China and India, because I think that's the key economic question in the next 30 years. And what it takes is you have to reform litigation, taxation, education, health, energy, and infrastructure. And that's what it takes. No. But the reason I tell you that is really simple. And I want all of you to just, the next time you start to get negative, you start to get depressed, I want you to remember something. This is a country which shouldn't have existed. We were created by people who had the courage to take on the most powerful empire on the planet. They fought for 8 years. Washington doesn't go home. He goes home for 2 weeks to Mount Vernon in 8 years. This is a country which survived itself. You're here in New Orleans. Go down to the battlefield where Jackson defeated the British army which had defeated Napoleon. We shouldn't exist. Go to Gettysburg or Antietam. Think about the pain it cost to keep this country together. Go to Lincoln Memorial and read Lincoln's second inaugural and understand the pain it took. Sometime, every June, we try to get radio stations to play Franklin Delano Roosevelt's 6.5-minute prayer, where he went on national radio during D-Day to ask the entire country to pray together for the young men who were landing in Europe. This is a tough country. We're about to do tough things again. And it's going to be hard, and we're going to have to recruit every American to decide that being an American patriot is more important than belly aching and whining and explaining why you ought to get yours without having to work for it. And it's going to be a very challenging 10 years, and my prediction is 10 years from now, in Beijing, they're going to sit around and go, well, we're not going to catch up in the next 100 years, but after all, we're a long-term player, so maybe our great-great-great-great-great-grandchildren will be competitive. And that ought to be our goal, is to say, let's go out, be Americans, invent the future, and the others get to pay royalties. Thank you all very, very much.